Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dark Rhino Security Confidential. This is your host, Manoj Tandon. Today we have another fabulous guest joining us with tons of experience. But before I announce him, I gotta say, please hit the like and subscribe button. I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing me say it, but just do it so that we can keep bringing you this great content and keep bringing you great guests who want to spend some time with us. So without further ado, today we're going to have Mr. John Carse join us all the way from Texas today. You might remember several episodes back, we had Vivek, the CEO of SquareX, join us. John is with SquareX, but in addition to being with SquareX, well, besides that, he's got a ton of experience in cyber. He's a Field CISO. He has been in the business for 20 years, working with some real brand names out there like the U.S. Navy, JPMorgan, Expedia, Dyson, to name a few. You know, he has built global security programs, and we're going to get into a lot more with them, and is right now developing the industry's first browser detection and response solution. We're honored to have him here. John, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Manoj. Great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
So are we. So just introduce yourself to the audience. Like, give us a little bit of a background on yourself.
Yeah, I didn't start in cyber. I actually started in just regular IT, which I think is great for all cyber practitioners to kind of get into. But yeah, I did a lot of work for the U.S. Navy. I spent probably more time with the U.S. Navy doing work and doing cyber work and securing systems, which gave me a lot of background before I went into industry. Like you said, I went to JPMorgan Chase. I was at Rakuten Mobile and Rakuten Symphony as their CISO. So some regulated industries, and then Dyson most recently before joining SquareX.
I was going to ask, you know, working at a place like Dyson and being the CISO, one thing that would come to mind is, you know, in the Far East, there's this fear, a lot of times justified, that intellectual property is not well respected. And I would imagine, as a CISO, you probably in addition to obviously preventing breaches, but the guarding of intellectual property would have been on your agenda. Was that a big item, or with DLP, or not so much?
I think that was my number one item. You know, in my cyber strategy there, the number one, I had like 5 objectives that I had for a cybersecurity strategy at Dyson, and the number one was keep Dyson secret. That was the number one. So a lot of what I did over the course of the 2 years was around protecting intellectual property from both insider risk, but also potential loss of intellectual property to contract manufacturers or other third parties that we worked with. So it was a very important part of what we did at Dyson, was protecting intellectual property.
And it's, I guess, for our audience, if you could, like, Apple does this as well. You know, most of their products are manufactured in China, although with the latest tariffs, who knows what's going to happen with that. But they keep things under wrap pretty well. What are the tenets of doing that? Like, what's the physicality of it? Like, so any company that's listening and is saying, hey, you know what, we do want to contract manufacture overseas, wherever that may be. Are there some aspects to cybersecurity that you could guide them, or tips that you would give that they must absolutely consider?
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that what comes top of mind for me is, good identity practices, making sure that the folks that are going and accessing wherever you're storing data or intellectual property, that they're using good technologies, whether it's whoever your IDP is, you're using MFA, SSO, you're using good ways of digital rights management and those kinds of technologies to make sure that you are securing your data right? But also securing who has access to the data. And then on the DRM side, making sure that you're able to control that that information, um, when it leaves your perimeter, right? So what kind of controls do you have in place when that that document leaves the perimeter? So you could say that, you can't print it, you can't share it on screens, you can't take screenshots of it. There's lots of things that you can do inside of our particular technology environment that we had there that allowed us to protect intellectual property, whether it was on inside of our environment and outside of our environment. So those are some things that you can do. um, we were very, very much into, like, again, it's an engineering shop. So, there's people that are using Arduinos or Raspberry Pis or other kind of technology inside of a lab environment that are dealing with data and everything else. So how do you make sure that that environment is secure, right? Meaning, like, what's coming into it, what's going out of it. And then it's just even like hardening systems and making sure that, you're not just able to plug in a USB drive into something and copy something over without knowing that that's happening, or managing that on an exception kind of basis. So there's so many controls that you can apply just at the operating system level to manage, like, who can transfer something via Bluetooth or over USB
Okay.
or over the network. Um, but it's definitely a very layered
I was going to say, and
approach to it.
you'd have to have a very good team that's diligent all the time, because some of the things you're describing we would put in the category of shadow IT. I am going to go get my black or my Raspberry Pi, and
Yeah, yeah.
and I'll do what I want to do with it because
Well, I
I'm a
mean, I mean,
development
when
guy.
you're if you're going to develop, if you're going to develop, you know, um, if you're going to develop consumer products, right, and you're going to make motors that work and stuff, then you're going to have some place for those engineers to work, right? It's kind of different than working in a technology company, for example, like an e-commerce based technology company that are selling digital products or things that can be moved around digitally, for like airline tickets, for example. Those have different kinds of control sets that you want to apply than you have with an engineering environment where you have things that you're manufacturing. So it's different. They're people are going to have to work. They're going to have to be able to move data around, but it's like you need to really understand their use cases. I think that at one point in time, I think we had like 144 different threats that we were monitoring, like, and we had to get our protection mechanisms around 144 different use cases. These were technical items that we applied to different use cases for different groups of engineers. So understanding what you can do and what you can't do and how people actually work, and and then applying those controls in a way that allows them to do their job, but you know, and having some sense that if something doesn't go the way you expect it to, that you can actually do an investigation and kind of follow up with those those items, right? So,
John,
but yeah, I guess definitely, if you were in a tech company, I would definitely feel like if you just had people with Raspberry Pis and Arduinos around, and including the military environment, I would not expect to see those in an environment or plugged into something on the network. But
sure.
there's definitely applications where that does make sense within respect to a particular business environment.
So, John, what's interesting to hear you speak about that is that you are you describe the controls and the strategy, but it's grounded in an understanding of the business. And that is something that I have to call out some of our colleagues on. I think a lot of times the folks in cybersecurity don't develop that understanding of business to be able to do what you just described.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of people forget that, well, I would say that the business has a strategy. They have a go-to-market plan. They think that there's some gap in the market that they want to fill, and they have those ideas that's why we're here, is to execute on that business. And then we bring technology to it, right? And we say, okay, the way that we're going to execute this is, we're going to apply these technologies, whether that's um, whatever they are, right? It doesn't really matter. But then after that, that's where I think cyber comes in. Whereas it's like there's a business strategy, there's a technology strategy, and then you have your cybersecurity strategy. It doesn't you don't start. You may say that you're security first, but you don't really start with the cybersecurity strategy because you don't know what the mechanisms of executing in the business are. And so if you're always saying no, right, which I try very hard, I'm willing to say no really too easily, right? I'm willing to say no, but I usually have another solution available. Like I can't do that, but I can do this, right? And again, my background is very technical. I was, I'm somewhat of a technical. I would put myself in a technical CISO
Okay.
kind of category. I'm somewhat, I would say, threat driven versus risk driven, right? So I really want to uh, understand what it is that the business is trying to do. What is it? What is its value chain look like? How does it create value? And then what technologies do we employ? And if I can influence technologies, then I will. I'd rather work with a software language that actually has that you can actually do stuff with, from a security perspective. If I can influence that, then yeah, I'll try. If I can use this operating system instead of that operating system, then I'll definitely try to influence that. But when it's all said and done, the business has an objective, the technology, the engineering teams have a way of solving the problem. And then from a cyber perspective, I'm somewhat left with um, managing what really turns into a very complex environment um, very quickly. I mean, some companies that I've worked for had like 200 different business units, right, or
Yep.
more business units, and each of those business units had a different technology stack. And I think when you're from a cyber perspective, you're kind of managing, depending on the size of the organization, the number of engineers that are there, the number of products that they're delivering. It becomes a very complex thing very quickly, but it's it's but I think you have to start with the business and how they're going to go deliver it first, and then you start applying your cyber strategy against it.
I'm I'm so glad to hear you say it, and I hope y- y- all the great people we've had on the show, and they've all been fantastic, have echoed similar things. And you've just stated it in a very different way, but I think it's so important what you've said. It's understand the business, then look at the controls, uh, not put the controls in and then look at the business, which seems to be the sometimes it can get carried away. Now, do you see in the Far East versus stateside companies, or I should say Western companies, is is there a difference in their acceptance of the role that cybersecurity plays in their organizations? Does one see it, i.e., does one see it as an impediment, yeah, as an impediment, and one sees it as an enabler? Is there any kind of thing like that yet your experience has shown?
I would say so. I think that um, from an East versus West kind of perspective, I felt, I guess, in companies in the West, right, and it totally depends on the industry, right? Some industries are much more regulation focused. But if I just took a tech company and a tech company, right, just a tech company in the West and a tech company in the East, the the tech company in the West is going to they're they're going to I don't know, I'm sure how I say this, but it seems like they're going to want to argue more,
Okay.
and make sure that that control is absolutely necessary, before they want to apply the control, whatever that control may be, doesn't really matter. Um, and as opposed to in the East, and I mean, my my experience there is going to be, Japan and Singapore. Um, but in my experience there, it's like we, would create a checklist, and it seems like everyone was like, okay, well, is this what we need to do? And they're like, yes. And it's also, it's definitely different working inside like a Japanese company, for example, meaning that, you have a lot of conversations with people as you go around, and you get everyone to kind of get into agreement before you bring it to the big boss. And then everyone says what they're supposed to say because you've already had those conversations. And that seemed to be like how the culture somewhat worked. Even if I, as an American, don't work that way, somehow I get pushed into these conversations where I'm being consensus driven. And then
Mm,
you come
go
together
ahead.
with the plan. And then once you've said that this is what the plan is going to be, and it could be that, the plan, if this is the checklist that we're going to do, then everyone somewhat goes towards that objective, right? And as you go through your approval channels, everyone has their opportunity to say that, yes, I approve it, or I approve it with these caveats and those kinds of things. And you kind of go through the progress, and everyone kind of knows what the risks are, and which is, as much as I would love to see that happen in like the Western companies that I've worked in, it, it doesn't seem to happen as often as
Well,
it
it's a
would happen.
cultural thing. I mean, you're looking at one that's a very conformist culture. The whole consensus before commitment,
Yeah.
is
It,
a there's a
yeah.
huge cultural element to that. I
And I
at
think
least
there is. I think there is. I think that, like I said, it's somewhat of a natural way of doing things, particularly in Japan. I think that I didn't really feel, I didn't really feel like once we had a plan in place. I think that it life was pretty easy for us to kind of like, if we decided that from a cybersecurity perspective or security perspective that this was something worth keeping, um, then people would go along. If And that wasn't always the case. I mean, there was definitely, just like any other place, everyone's, going to have questions, especially if it starts slowing down your ability to deliver on time. And then I think that's another important part of what it is from a cybersecurity perspective is making sure is, I think one of the a great book, and I won't remember the author's name, but it's called The Goal. Have you ever read The Goal?
yeah, Eliyahu Goldratt, very
Yeah,
much
that's right. That's
so.
right. Yeah.
Theory of constraints, know it
Theory of
well.
constraints. Theory of constraints, exactly. And I think that's a great book. And even though it's, kind of focused on manufacturing, you can just think of it just any kind of process. And if anything that
Eh,
you do is actually making things better, right? Helping you deliver where you need to deliver the quality that you need to be delivered, including security quality, then those are good things. If you're doing something and you can't tell if it made it better or worse, right? Or if it does make it worse, then you kind of have to remove it from the cycle. Um, and I think that seemed to be just somewhat a normal kind of way of working in Asia, where it's like, okay, are we getting something of value out of it? No, then it's okay to have that kind of Kaizen moment and make it better, right? And again, from a cyber perspective, I think it's also incumbent upon us that if we're going to introduce a control, that we try to make the control as easy to adopt as possible. We really shouldn't be creating controls that are difficult for us to explain and for difficult for other people to implement, and uh,
Absolutely. I mean that goes against the fundamental premise of the goal, which is increasing throughput, right? I
yes,
mean
yes, exactly. Right. We want to
right.
increase throughput, right? And so and what I'm looking for is, I'm always looking for technology to help me achieve the objective. Hopefully technology that helps the rest of the engineering teams and delivery teams achieve their objectives as well. Um, the more we can work together, I think the better off the company is. Because I mean, but also we need, cyber folks tend to we tend to discuss things like they're it's obvious, meaning like, oh, you have a lot of vulnerabilities, and you have a lot of risk. And that's true. I mean, you have inherent risk in, just having more vulnerabilities that are in the system. Um, however, a lot of times they don't materialize the way that you think they're going to, right? And so we don't have as many breaches as you would think that you would have. And I think facts need to kind of come into how we manage risk as well, right? Because
Yep.
there's compensating controls or mitigating circumstances that cause this vulnerability to be useful or not useful, and those are important considerations as well when you're thinking about how much risk that the business is carrying and whether they're actual risks or not. It's so, but it's an easy number to say how many vulnerabilities you have and how long they've been there,
Yeah.
but it's a completely different thing to say that it's actually creating um, it's actually something that the likelihood of it's going to happen, that you're going to have a breach
Because of that vulnerability. Yeah. I
because
mean,
of that
it's
vulnerability. And then sometimes
there.
it's like the vulnerability doesn't even apply to the platform you're talking about. It's like, oh, you have this Java code, but it's only a problem on Windows for this vulnerability. It's not a problem on Linux, and you run Linux environments. There's a lot of somewhat nuances in how applicable things are. And again, we as cyber people need to kind of understand what that is before we go high and
So
right.
in your latest incarnation, continuing on controls, you're helping develop a BDR solution.
Hmm.
Why did you? What do you see about BDR? First of all, you might want to explain what BDR is to the audience, and then why pick BDR as a key focus point? There must be something behind it that you saw that was very intriguing.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's so browser detection and response. If I explained it just succinctly, it would be uh, the ability to see what's happening inside of an application, like instrumenting an application in a way that allows us to see every everything that happens there, and then be able to take an action on it. So once you have like full visibility on like what's going on in the browser, then you can detect activity and then you can respond to it, right? So it's very much like what you would think EDR is doing for you on your desktop and for your operating system, but inside the browser, if that helps. So
Yeah.
so I think that with my as we were talking about uh, Dyson and intellectual property protection, and how is it that um, you're going to protect intellectual property, right? Or there were there were a lot of things that I thought I understood about security before I really started digging into how you protect intellectual property. And I think that, because, especially in SaaS driven environments, and we
Hmm.
have way more SaaS driven environments today than we did 20 years ago,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
As AV came out and EDR tools came out and they were pushing the stuff onto our endpoints, we were working in environments that were very much corporate office and our data centers, right? If you're in a big enterprise, right? And, being able to control traffic with, um, proxy servers or, and putting IDSs in places where you were in total control of everything, including where your applications were built. That's the environment that I grew up in. Very much control of the network. We did everything for the network.
Yep.
In today's world, that's not the way we operate. Many enterprise IT shops are very dependent on um, SaaS products, whether that's M365 and you have E3 or E5 license, or F3,
Sure.
F5 license, or you're using Google Workspace. Those are incredibly easy for an enterprise to adopt, right? There's
Yes.
just like any SaaS or cloud products, it's subscription based. It's based on the users that we have and that kind of stuff. So it's a very easy model for us to adopt. And then it takes the burden of running the IT out away from our IT teams, right? Which means that we can do other things with those people.
Yep.
Um, However, if you start looking at, and this is what was surprising to me, was when we started looking at use cases and everything else, it was very clear to see that I actually did not with those basic tools. And even though I had, EDR tools and whatever around, what I could actually affect in the browser really wasn't available to me. Right. We kept seeing attacks that were being executed, that were successful, that were happening, in the browser, right? It's like, because you click a link and it's a phishing and it goes off to, and you hit a browser, then you're going off to somewhere else. The being able to like control where that activity was going to happen, or whether activity was happening, within, was it, it's like I could just turn off all of Gmail, right? All of, Gmail, or I could, just steer people away from it with my tools, or I had to have like exceptions in my policy so that, because we did have some people that were using Google Workspace, right?
Okay.
For whatever reason. Um, but it's like now I have this gap in my architecture where now that person can go to Google Workspace or they can go to their personal Gmail, right? So it's like you start having I started seeing like all these things that people were doing and they had good reasons for doing it, but I didn't really have a way of detecting poor behavior or or illicit behavior, whether that was intentional or not intentional. I just didn't have that kind of control in the browser when I was there.
But not in the browser, but some security practitioners would say that a lot of the tools exist, whether that be through DLP or that be through CASB or it be
Yep.
through EDR or through
Yep.
some other zero trust approach, you know, that yes, it's not directly in the browser, but you have surrounded with enough that you
Yeah.
do have a degree of visibility and control. And
Yeah. And
what
for sure.
I'm
I mean,
playing
there's
devil's
definitely
advocate. So what's
no, no,
your
no, no. It's true. Um, I think that there is true. There's some applicability of like DLP, like DLP tools, but most of the DLP tools that we used and that we went through a procurement cycle and trying to choose the best one. When we were looking at them, they were able to work on certain browsers, but not other browsers, right? On this operating system, not these other operating systems. And, and again, and then what they could detect and prevent were not they didn't have a lot of context of what was going on in that environment. For example, um, personal OneDrive versus corporate OneDrive. The context between those two weren't available to that application. You could say, I don't want to see this kind of information move, but you couldn't say, you could only do it in this browser on this operating system, but you couldn't really steer them away from certain activities. But what I found was that there were lots and lots and lots of gaps. And I think what excited me about SquareX and what excited me about BDR was that the same technology that we were using to be able to detect threats that were happening on the wire, we could also use for DLP kind of capabilities as well, right? So if I don't want someone to, paste information into a Gen AI chat bot, Chat GPT, then I can stop that today. But it's not something that I was able to stop with my existing tool set that I had before, right? Because it's I
that
could
means
either
you're
steer them
putting
there, I could just say block, with my CASB and SWG tools, I could say don't let people go to Chat GPT. I could just stop them, right? But that's kind of a steering question. It's like, are you going to allow someone to go here, or are you not going to allow someone to go here? But when you have use cases where look, it's okay for people to use Chat GPT, but they need to be inside the enterprise agreement. Then they should be authenticating with their corporate credentials instead of their personal credentials. Then those are agreements that we want to be able to have and maintain and allow people to have access to the tooling. But at the same time, how do you stop them from uploading your intellectual property into a um, personal, not protected by an enterprise agreement version of Chat GPT, right? I'm using Chat GPT kind of it really wouldn't matter
It's
what
a
it
great
was.
example.
It really wouldn't matter if it was Pastebin or
Yeah,
some, PDF to Word converter or uh, JSON beautifier. These are all, from a intellectual property loss perspective, people are using Postman to do, put, the personal version of Postman, which makes everything public, if to do APIs and managing APIs, and invariably you're putting your secret keys in there. They're just also being saved, in the environment. But you want people to use Postman, right?
yep,
So it's easy to say steer away from Pastebin, but when you're actually using tools that have either free licenses or enterprise licenses, and the enterprise licenses actually protect the company because you have an agreement with them, being able to know what context people are working in and then preventing them from working in a personal context where your enterprise agreement isn't effectuated, then those things start to matter, right? And so, and as a cyber teams are never seemingly big enough to handle the number of use cases that the 14,000, 15,000, 30,000, 400,000 employees want to have. You just never have enough cyber people to kind of figure it out. So you
sure.
gotta start building rule sets and having capabilities that allow you to uh, have that granularity with how you're working with your, in particular your SaaS apps, right? So, and in your cloud, in your public cloud environments.
So does BDR then end up replacing a whole bunch of other potential tools, or do you keep them for redundancy? I mean, what's the
Oh,
secure?
I mean, listen, never give up security controls, right? Invariably, like if you have EDR tools, keep your EDR tools. I mean, there are going to be times, it doesn't matter what the technology is, or, just uh, changes in your rule set that are going to allow an attack to get to your operating system. Having an EDR tool is the right thing to do. Having your CASB, SWG, your SASE tools in place to help you with where it's helping those should be maintained. What I guess what I'm proposing is that a lot of that activity is going through that browser.
Yep,
And I think some of the research that we've seen is that 80% of people's time is is in the browser today. They're spending their time in a browser, going from one application to another application, from this SaaS app to that SaaS app. And we're in a browser right now recording this session. It's
yes, we are.
amazing what browsers can do today. And as a result, if you can prevent, like, for example, if you can prevent an activity from occurring, at the place where people are working, then you're better off doing that. It's better off preventing in the browser where people are working than waiting for something to land on the disk in the case of an attack and you're worried about something into your corporate environment. However, like, your EDR tool isn't really going to help you with you copying and pasting from your customer service app and you're pasting it into WhatsApp. Your EDR tool is never going to help you with that,
Right.
right? But you do want your customer service agents to be able to work with customers wherever they are. If they're in WeChat or WhatsApp or this, that, or
Yep.
whatever, you want them to be able to communicate in those channels. How do you, as a cybersecurity practitioner, control that when it's all in a browser, right? And so that's important from a intellectual property protection perspective, but it's also important from a workability. Can you help the business operate at a higher level and more cleanly um, than at a lower price point than if you were going to build out an incredibly complex VDI environment so that you can work with a
I
contract
would
call
answer,
center.
yeah. I mean, complexity equals cost, and if you can
Yes. Yeah.
intercept at the source point, it makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah,
Now, what
but
about
definitely
in an
augment. augment with BDR. Don't don't replace all your security controls with it.
Now, I keep forgetting because a lot of our customer base that we service is in the SMB. So those guys want simplification because they can't afford a system like systems like JPMorgan could, right? For obvious
100%.
reasons, right?
Right, right.
But what about those who are in purely virtualized environments? So you see a lot of people in the medical industry that are on high trust. They've gone to
Mhm.
pure virtualization. So the browser really is doing nothing. I mean, it's really just displaying an image back from, a central computing place.
Yeah, I think that so I don't know too much about high trust, but let me think about this in slightly different terms, right? But I think what you're saying is that they have basically some sort of browser isolation that's happening in front of
Sure.
them, right? And they may,
Absolutely.
and again, I've talked to some customers that have um, environments that are, they get to VDI, they get
Yep.
into they get into this closed environment, and then they're using a web browser from inside that environment to access different things.
Yep.
And um, yeah, that's sounds expensive, right?
It is expensive. It's
It
very
sounds
expensive.
complex. And for the most part, if you're in a closed environment, then um, then you're limited to what it is that you can and can't do. And again, it totally depends on what the use cases are, and it may be completely reasonable to have a completely closed in environment. I mean, if you work in military environments, this is like a normal part of your everyday life, is that you go in, you put your cell phone into a little lockbox, they close it, you get your key, you go in your space, and you have unclassed workstation and a classified workstation, and that classified workstation has no access to the internet or anything else. It's just there for you to do your work in that classified space, and that is incredibly reasonable requirement for that environment. And however, I think that even in those situations, you know um, even in those situations where you could probably get away with having fewer controls, it isn't bad to have controls. I mean, it's good to understand, if you think that all because you have a closed environment that people aren't moving things around and that kind of stuff, it's what we've seen with a number of breaches that happened in the military, is that people did have access to CD-ROMs and things and be able to move things to their
Right.
local systems and able to get that off the network. And Snowden would be an example of that. Um, from a long time ago. But but those things do happen, and it would be better to have controls that you were saying, hey, you know what, this is activity that I would not expect to see, and then investigating that activity before you figured out that you did actually have a hole in your environment that you just didn't know about. I mean, you had to get to that VDA environment somehow. There was
Yes,
some
you
firewall
did.
rule that allowed you to get over there. Um,
Uh, so, John, we are actually at the hour, I'm being
oh,
reminded.
okay,
But
okay.
we wanted to leave a minute or two here for you to plug whatever you'd like to, or give our audience, anything you'd like them to go to, be made aware of. Please, it's your floor. I'll stop with the questions.
No, I think that um, what I'm evangelizing today is that, that's what I'm doing right now, is thinking about you do have controls in place. However, take a look at what's happening in your browser. Think about how the world has changed in the last, since 2006, and how we used to manage things and then how we manage things today, right? And how much our users are spending time in SaaS apps inside the browser, having access to a lot of information. Sometimes we don't even know where they're moving data, and all of that's happening in the browser. Do you feel secure with what it is that you know about what's happening in your browser? Um, And I would suspect that when you look at it and you dig into it, you're going to say, look, I need more visibility here. Come talk to us. We're happy to help.
That's fantastic, John. And best way to get a hold of you guys is how?
I think that probably the best way of getting a hold of us is just send an email to founder@squarex.com, SQRX.com. If you go to browser.security, there's a lot of ways that you can test your browser, and there's some ways for you to contact us on that site as well. Browser.security, and of course, SquareX.com, SQRX.com.
Well, John, this has been way too short a conversation. Would love to continue it at some point, but this has been fantastic. Thank you for being so generous with your time today.
Thanks, Manoj. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Hope to see you back here soon.
Thanks. Bye.